Welcome to the Student Ministry Matters podcast. We want to encourage, equip, and connect those with a passion to impact the next generation for Jesus Christ. Student ministry can be a lonely place. You might even feel like you're the only one in your church or community that cares about students. Well, know this, you're not alone. People all across the country are engaging Gen Z and care deeply about the spiritual direction of these young men and women. Whether you're full-time, part-time, bivocational, or volunteer, if you have a heart for students, this is the place for you.
Welcome to the podcast. My name is Dan Carson. I'm the pastor of family ministries at Calvary Baptist Church in Fayetteville, Arkansas, but I'm also the director of Student Ministry Matters. On today's podcast, we are going to lean into that idea of being a lifelong learner and the idea of audio learning or learning through podcasts. And so we just wanted to take a few moments today and share about some podcasts that we love. So Chris, what's been going on in your life?
Man, kind of the same old stuff. Don't say that in a bad way, though. It's been good. Been going to school, teaching school, doing ministry, and living the dream in Hope, Arkansas.
I love that. What's your official title there in Hope?
Man, that's a great question. I've had a few. It actually is interesting that you say that because as we record this, we're about a week away from a personnel meeting. We're kind of revisiting the idea of titles and just job descriptions and things like that. And so basically I am a student pastor. The way I introduce myself is I am the family discipleship pastor at Garrett. How it's kind of evolved over the last 8 years of being here is I've gone from just student ministry to getting more of an associate type role, just with different tasks and things like that. Titles can sometimes be overshot. If we want to be honest about it. So I'm not really concerned about a title, but, over the last, I'd say 3 years, my role has expanded a little bit to include other ministries than just student ministry and different tasks and things like that. So if you want to call me the family discipleship pastor, I'm great with that. If you want to call me a student pastor or youth pastor, I'm good with that. Associate pastor, whatever. You can call me whatever. Most people call me anyway. And anyway, It's good.
That's been it for me. Over the years, I've held, I think, all the different titles. I mean, they really, what it boils down to is those of us, whether you're listening to this now, you're a guy or a girl who has been involved with ministry with students. You might have been the youth director. You might have been the youth pastor. You might have been, the list goes on. Now I'm the pastor of family ministries, but guess what? That means cradle to college. So student ministry falls into that category.
That's right. Right. I was talking to one of our pastors in one of our churches down in Texas recently. I won't say who he was or who he is rather, but I was asking him about this very thing because I was kind of doing some research, like what do people call themselves? What are the titles that people take and all this kind of stuff. And so I thought about this one guy. And so I looked at their website, and his title is on the website is experienced pastor.
Ooh.
And I was like, that's interesting. But what is it? And so I just sent him an email. I was like, hey man, just wondering, like, what is this? Who are you? Why is it unique? All that kind of thing. And I thought he had a pretty, again, he admitted like, well, we're not sold on the idea of that title just because it does come with, like, when you introduce yourself as the experienced pastor, people are like, what does that mean? And then it's just an explanation. But he basically broke it down and saying, his pastor is the what are we going to do guy, and he is the how are we going to do it. And he's like, we just figure that experienced pastor would be more suitable than a how-to pastor. And so I was like, well, to me, you are now the how pastor. And so see you later. And anyway, so there you go. I mean, there's titles all the way out there. I mean, I think it's just unique to every title seems to be a little bit the same, but then also has a little bit of flair. And I think part of it is we try to find titles sometimes that are just not the norm, because we don't want to be so old fashioned to say I'm an associate pastor, but when it comes down to it, yeah, that's what you are.
That's it. We are helping often helping fulfill the ministry that our lead pastor is leading in.
That's right.
So I've been the minister of church growth. I was the assistant to the pastor at one place. I was the associate pastor somewhere else, youth and worship pastor, youth and music director. I mean, again, they're just, they're words, but they're powerful words. And so it's important for us to listen, to lean into those things and to get it as right as we can. And so I think a good descriptor helps our people understand. Because, again, words are powerful. People at CBC understand that words are powerful as well. CBC is our podcast sponsor. And if you're looking for a place for your students to check out, to see what's next in their educational journey, we encourage you to have them go to cbc.edu. You can also find them on Instagram and Facebook and all sorts of places like that so they can see what's happening at Central Baptist College of Conway. I'd encourage you to have them check it out. It's challenging, engaging, inspiring, or perhaps you are a student yourself. You're looking for the opportunity to finish up a degree that maybe you started but had to take a break. Life happened, and you would like to go back and finish that up. They have a PACE program that is designed for that non-traditional student. And so, again, you can find out more information there at cbc.edu. Well, again, we're going to be talking about the podcasts that we listen to, that we love, maybe a strong word, but it is the podcast that we spend some time with as we look at what's in our ministry, because we want to be lifelong learners. We can do that, of course, through reading. And we've talked about some of the books that are important to us, and we'll, I'm sure, go back to that again because books are very important. But God calls us to this idea of learning throughout our lifetime. That's the reason conferences are important. That's the reason books are important. Classes, continuing your education. We all need to do those things. And perhaps you can't go to school right now. Perhaps you can't even make it to a great bookstore. Well, if you've got a smartphone, you have access to a whole bunch of different voices, a whole bunch of different learning opportunities, some good people out there. And so you want to find some podcasts that work for you. So, Chris, let me ask you a question. We didn't talk about this beforehand, so this might throw you for a loop. But what are you looking for in a good ministry or a good leadership podcast? What are some components that you want to find?
Free stuff. I want it to be all about me. Listen, if it's going to be worth me listening to, they're going to make much of me. Let's just nice. Get right down to it. I want to get free stuff. Man, no, obviously I'm kind of not joking, but when I look at ministry podcasts, I mean, personally, I categorize that. I probably break that down even further. And I think, okay, like theology, just things that are going to stretch me in my thinking and take me a little bit deeper into particular doctrines and just make me think. So I think in that term, so I look for podcasts that do that. But then also look for podcasts that are going to meet me kind of where I'm at. So that's kind of the me-centered aspect that I was referring to. I deal primarily with families, students, and also work within our church with other ministry leaders. And so I like finding podcasts that are going to help me continue to think better and do better in those regards. So it's like what you've already said, this ongoing learning experience. So, I mean, it's not to say that I don't enjoy hearing senior pastors talk, and, I do, but like specifically when I'm going to listen to something, if I'm going to take time to listen, then I want to make sure. And if it's in that vein of, or that genre, so to speak, of ministry, I want it to be pertinent to where I'm at right now.
There are a lot of churches out there that provide a podcast of their Sunday morning message. And you have the opportunity to listen to sermon after sermon after sermon. But I think what Chris is saying and the way I feel about it is I want something that's going to help me as I lead others. And so, yes, I do want to learn. I do want to hear God's word. And if I can hear somebody who is eloquent, who is, for lack of a better description, entertaining, that I can gain some knowledge from, I'm going to listen to them. I mean, I'm going to listen to their sermons, but for the most part, I'm doing the same thing. I'm looking for things that are going to hit me where I'm at. Well, let's go ahead and kind of just hop into it, Chris. If we are looking for youth ministry podcasts, are there some that you that are your go-tos?
I'll be honest, I don't listen to a lot of youth ministry podcasts, but I also haven't searched out there. But what I have gone back to over and over, and it's not something I listen to on a weekly, but I do check in with the Download Youth Ministry, the DYM podcast with Doug Fields, Josh Griffin, those guys, just because, man, they've been in the game for a long time. It doesn't mean that I necessarily agree with all of their things that they say. I rarely agree with everything that I hear on a podcast, but that's okay. I'm not just sitting there trying to pinpoint all the things that I disagree with. I'm trying to gather up helpful ideas, and just things that would really kind of open my mind up to think within my own ministry. And the DYM podcast seems to do that. I just like to hear them talk about particular subjects. And again, they've been in the game for a long time. They've got a lot of experience underneath their belt, and they're fresh. I like.
They are. They are.
That's a good Gen Z word, right? Fresh.
Sure.
Or
sure.
They're dripping.
Oh my goodness. Well, what's great about their podcast specifically, it is well produced. It is entertaining because these guys have been around for a while. I can relate to them because of the age thing. But one of the interesting things to me is that they apply it to the smaller church situation. And that's one of the big problems that I find with a lot of youth ministry podcasts is they don't understand the normative size church. They're talking to a church group. Well, they got 50 kids or they got 100 kids. And, and really Josh and Doug have a huge number of students that are impacting, but they bring their principles down to the level that's going to help us what we're looking at. Well, do you have any other youth ministry podcasts that you kind of go back to?
Oh man, I knew you were going to ask that follow-up question. Student Ministry Matters.
Of course.
Gosh.
If you're not listening to this one.
Because I just love to hear myself talk. No. Oh my gosh. There's going to be somebody out there that takes me way too seriously. Again, I don't listen to a lot of student ministry podcasts. Yeah. And so if you have one out, if you're a listener to our podcast and you have a student ministry podcast, it's not that I don't like you. It's probably just because I don't know about it. So I'd love to listen to your podcast.
And we're always open to share some good podcasts.
Yeah.
If you have one that you listen to that you love in student ministry, be sure and put that in the comments. Help us to spread those around. I've got a couple. One that I've been listening to lately is called the Youth Ministry Maverick by Jeff Harding. He's just real solid, everything that I've heard so far. There is one that some of our friends out of Texas, Jimmy Brock, he was at Farley Street Baptist Church in Waxahachie, that's a mouthful, Texas. But now he's the ABS leader at the Southern Arkansas University. They did the How To Youth Ministry podcast, but since they've changed so much, he's now a college director. One of the other guys is now a full-time lead pastor. They've changed it. It's called the Ministry Hour, and they're still covering some student ministry topics, but that's a good one. And then there's Lifeway. They have the Student Ministry podcast, which is just solid. I mean, my only complaint, and it's not a huge complaint, is that there is that tendency to make it more about the bigger church. If you've got a core group of volunteers of 6 to 10 or, even 15 volunteers that are helping you. And that's not the case with many of our listeners. It's you, or maybe you and 2 other people, and you're just struggling to find the way. So if you know of some that are really geared towards the smaller church, the more normal sized church, be sure and let us know so that we can kind of share that along in this process. Well, Chris, what about ministry podcasts? What are you listening to?
All right. So there's a lot out there, I know. Kind of things that I go back to. I like to listen to Doctrine and Devotion.
Okay.
That's one with a couple of pastors up in Illinois. They are a part of a of a church there. They're fun guys. I just went completely blank on their names. Jimmy Fowler is one of the co-pastors, and goodness gracious, I just went completely blank on the other guy's name. Joe Thorne. There you go. Thank you. Joe Thorne, Jimmy Fowler, Doctrine and Devotion. They've got a lot of banter. They're fun to listen to. Sometimes they can be frustrating to listen to because you're like, okay, just get to the point of whatever it is and then when they do get to the point, they get back to the banter part, and it's like, okay, and so there's times where I get a little put out, but most of the time they've got some good conversations going, and I like listening to them.
What else?
All right, so Doctrine and Devotion. I like listening to Truth for Life with Alistair Begg. I don't listen to a lot of sermons preached. It's not because I don't like listening to sermons. I'm just careful with that because I'm speaking so much. I don't want to necessarily become just a parrot of what I'm hearing. And so, and also it's an intentional device that I put in place as far as not listening to a lot of sermons. If I do, then I tend to go there too early in my sermon prep. I want to be able to, when I'm making a sermon, I want to be able to wrestle with the text. I want to try to figure these things out. And so if I listen to a sermon, and it's rare that I do before I preach, it usually is just because I'm having a hard time making things come together when it comes to application, and I want to just hear how somebody else does it. But I love Alistair Begg. He's just got a great way of, I think, working through the text of Scripture and also, of course, presenting it. I mean, gosh, he's got such a cool voice, right? And if you've never heard of Alistair Begg, so Truth for Life, I listen to that. I haven't listened to it a lot, but we interviewed him a while back. But the Chair 2 Leader podcast with Ben South and those guys, I think that's a good podcast to check out. Chair 2 Leaders,
it's great, especially for our listeners, because you're focused in on the Chair 2 leader in the church for the most part. And most of us that are serving in student ministry are Chair 2, or as we've said, Chair 3 or 4, wherever we're at in that process, but we're not the lead guy. And so they cover a lot of great things in that regard.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would say, not to go too much on this subject, but over the last, I would say 2 years, the Lord has been putting a particular desire within my heart to just be a great help to my senior pastor, to my lead pastor.
Yeah.
And it's not one that I don't have a desire to try to take over or anything like that. Like we have a great relationship as far as being a team and accomplishing particular tasks. But I know, and one thing I think I'm starting to realize is just how much weight can fall, can fall on his shoulders at any point throughout the year, whether, just because of the work of the ministry, just things that come up. And so he is a great expositor of the word and a great preacher, and he wants to spend a lot of time with that. And so I try to find ways to help ease some of the things that he has. I don't always do that well, but the Chair 2 Leader podcast, I think, helps spark some ideas there. And I think they do a good job. So I do like that one. There's a new podcast that I've started listening to more devotionally. It's called In the Lord I Take Refuge with Dane Ortlund. It's Dane Ortlund just basically just going through the Psalms. So there's short episodes, and I like that. Because normally if I'm listening to a podcast while I'm stationary, not driving, in other words, they need to be short. I don't normally sit at my desk and listen for 40 minutes to a podcast, and I just don't have the kind of mind to be able to work on something while a podcast is going in the background. So I like the short nature of In the Lord I Take Refuge. And Dane Ortlund has put out a couple of good books recently that I've really enjoyed, Gentle and Lowly, and then one that I'm currently working through called Deeper. And so those are just some bonus books to check out. And then again, I've got a long list, and Dan, I don't want to take away from your list. Maybe one more I would add to what we have said is, and this is a ministry podcast, but it's also a practical ministry podcast. So I've talked about some devotional types, but it's called Church for the Rest of Us. This is a podcast out of Family Church, which is down in the south part of Florida in West Palm Beach area. Jimmy Scroggins is the pastor there. They had basically a little day conference that was meant for their regional churches a few years ago, and we just saw it, and it happened to work out in our schedules where we could take off, and we went. And they just did a great job of they're a big church. They've got a really cool history of how their church has been revitalized. And anyway, they just did a great job of meeting pastors of churches of all sizes, just kind of where they are, and helping them say, hey, start with what you've got and just be faithful there. And so from that kind of spawned a continuing conference called Church for the Rest of Us, but then also a podcast like this with Jimmy Scroggins and some other co-hosts. And so I go back to that semi-regularly just to hear what they're talking about, see if I can get any kind of cool ideas and thoughts when it comes to just doing ministry. And so Church for the Rest of Us, I think, is a good podcast as well.
What is amazing to me is how God has just opened up this opportunity. Now we're able to share with one another. Those guys are sharing, we're sharing, just people all across, not just the state or the country, but all around the world are sharing concepts. I know that we've been blessed and we have listeners in 19 other countries. I mean, how crazy is that?
Wow, man. I bet they love our non-Arkansas accents.
Oh yeah.
I know for me, I have no accent whatsoever. I'm like from the north.
You bet. Well, I've got a few that fall into some good ministry podcasts. I like listening to Preaching and Preachers with Jason Allen. He's the president of Midwestern, and he has some great interviews on there. It just talks about a variety of things, but especially for those of us who are serving in this role, who find ourselves with that other title of preacher. It's a great one. There is another one called Pastor's Talk that is done by Mark Dever and Jonathan Lehman. And they just talk about some concepts. Now, they're very conservative in their approach to church, but it's a great one to listen to. And then there's For the Church podcast hosted by Jared Wilson that comes out of Midwestern as well. He just talks about a wide range of things, but again, all around that concept and kind of what drives Midwestern is this motto of For the Church. That's why they exist. And so a lot of those podcasts come from that. Now, there are a couple that are done by some friends of ours. There is the Healthy Church podcast that is Larry Barker and Drew Klein. They talk about all sorts of issues in regard to leadership and church health and just do a great job there. There are some follow-up things that you can be involved with, and they'll talk about that on their podcast. But the other one that I listen to on a regular basis is the Preaching Lab. These are friends, specifically Chris, his pastor, is a major part of that, and they're great to listen to. They're fun to listen to, and then they really have a heart for helping those who are preaching, whether it is the part-time preacher in your church, and maybe the youth pastor, or maybe it's the guy who's in the pulpit every week. They have a desire to see those guys do their absolute best and have, what is the phrase, healthy pastors, healthy pulpits, or is it
That's
reversed?
Right. That's it. Healthy pastors, healthy pulpits.
Yeah, and it's fantastic.
Hey, and let me put a shameless plug in there for them real quick, because in one of their most recent episodes, they've unveiled this new endeavor that will begin in 2022, called the Preaching Lab Cohorts. And so basically what that is it's just small groups of pastors that will come together. If you want to be a part of it, you can just kind of reach out and see if there's one close to you. And starting in January of 2022, there'll be just kind of these little preaching cohorts where we'll be meeting in a small group type session and focusing on the health of the pastor, and then also on the health of the pulpit. And so there's certain how that'll go down. Just check out their podcast. They explain it, but pretty cool stuff that if you want to get into relationship with a small group of like-minded preachers and pastors, you'll have that opportunity. And so, yeah, shameless plug there, Preaching Lab. It is a good podcast. And it's also fun. I'm glad you mentioned those two with Brother Larry Barker and of course with Cliff and those guys with the Preaching Lab, because it's fun for me as a BMA Baptist missionary, associational Baptist, to hear conversations with guys who are also in that work, because you just kind of get this sense that, hey, man, I'm not in this alone. We've got, there's commonality there. And, so I'll say another shameless plug. If you don't know anything about the BMA, man, check us out. I believe we're doing a lot of good kingdom work here and around the world.
There is, and it's coming up. It's October 24th throughout our churches is something called Life Word Sunday. It's a day that we celebrate Life Word ministries, and you can find them in a variety of places and a variety of ways. But it is all about sharing the gospel through media. And so you can look that up on Facebook, and we'll have a link in our show notes. Well, there are a couple other ministry podcasts that I wanted to mention. As you know, I'm working on my doctorate of ministry specifically in church revitalization. So there are a handful of podcasts that I'm listening to every week that kind of fit that category about either a strong emphasis in an area or specifically on revitalization. And one is Raynor on Leadership with Dr. Tom Raynor and his son, Sam. They do a great job. They are 25 minutes in length. I mean, they're very consistent, not like us.
What are you talking about? We're consistently long.
Yeah. I love listening to Making Disciples with Robbie Gallaty. For the first, over 100 episodes, Chris Swain was his co-host. They're stepping through what's that is looking like next. But then specifically in church revitalization, there are a couple that I'm listening to right now. One is Revitalize and Replant with Tom Raynor. And usually it's either Kevin Ezell or Mark Clifton are his co-hosts on that, and they alternate back and forth. But there's another one that is put out by the Malfers Group called Church Revitalization Podcast. And so I'm listening to that. Oh, I forgot about one other called the Replant Boot Camp. And so if you're looking for some tips and helps to step through some of those issues in your church about revitalization, those are all good ones. Chris, you got any other leadership or ministry ones that you want to mention?
One I didn't say is Preacher's Talk. This is a podcast by 9 Marks as well. I believe it. Yeah, it's by 9 Marks. And anyway, just if you're a preacher and you enjoy preaching, these guys do a great job. David Helm is one of the co-hosts on there. And I just recently found these guys. This is actually a recommendation through my pastor, Cliff. And so Preacher's Talk is a good one. And yeah, I think that's probably where I probably should stop, because I've got one, but man, it kind of falls into that fun category.
Okay. Well, and that's where we're headed. We've talked about, of course, youth ministry podcasts. We've talked about ministry and leadership podcasts. And so now we want to get to guilty pleasures, those things in podcasts that we may listen to, but don't necessarily have any specific value. Is that fair to say?
Maybe. Yeah, sure.
Mine definitely. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So Chris, go for it.
Well, if you're into Christian podcasts, and you've most definitely, I'm assuming, heard of the rise and fall of Mars Hill. There's a new podcast out there by Christianity Today, kind of chronicling and giving the history behind the rise and fall of Mars Hill, and of course their previous pastor. And anyway, that's been a good one. I've enjoyed listening to that. There's always a critic out there, and I've certainly got my criticism for it, but that's not what this podcast is for. But it's one that I've been listening to. It's one I've been going back to listening. It's just been interesting to hear all the things that they say. So that's one of my, I guess, guilty pleasures. But then, man, there's another one, and this has nothing to do with ministry. This is called Crime Junkie. Crime Junkie podcast. These two girls, ladies on there, they, I don't know, they just have this narrated script that they are telling basically stories of true crime, and it's some unsolved mysteries, and then there's solved mysteries, there's abductions and all this kind of stuff. And so, like, right now in October, as time is changing, as I drive down long highways by myself, I turn on Crime Junkie and get scared and have to constantly be looking in the back seat to see if something's going to jump out. So, yeah. In fact, I'll tell you this. I was listening to Crime Junkie about a year ago when we were driving through the wide open plains in Wyoming. And the particular one that I was listening to had to do with this murder case, this serial killer that was in like from Montana. I mean, just not far from where I was driving. And as I was driving, it was just talking about how their bodies were found in these wide open fields. And I'm just driving, looking at these wide open fields. And I'm like, my goodness, this is so eerie. So anyway, there's a guilty pleasure, Crime Junkie. I like it.
My ministry assistant, she absolutely loved murder podcasts. And so
Yeah.
I'd come up to her, she'd be folding bulletins and she'd have one ear in and she'd be, I said, what are you listening to? Murder podcasts. And I'm like, Amanda, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
So
What about you, man? What are you listening to for fun?
For fun, up until just recently, and I've made some choices, but up until just recently, I collected, and I still have them, comic books, superheroes, that sort of thing. And there is a podcast. These guys aren't believers, so this is definitely not falling the Christian category, but it's called iFanboy. And they would review comic books and comic and superhero movies and shows and things like that. And so they kind of spoke my geek language, and I appreciated them. However, recently I've gotten kind of, I don't want to say obsessed with The Office, but I've gone back to it. And so I've been watching a lot of it. Well, there are two podcasts that are really good. One's called The Office Deep Dive with Brian Bumgarner, who was Kevin. And it's just so weird. He sounds so different. I mean, he was definitely playing a character there.
Yeah.
But the other one is Office Ladies with Angela.
I've heard of that one. I haven't listened to it though.
Fisher. Yeah. And it is fantastic. They're goofy, they're about my same age. I mean, so I'm listening to them and they're talking about their past and everything else. And, just, you learn all these ins and outs of what the show was like and what was going on there. And so that's been my guilty pleasure right now is I'll listen and see what's on. And so, you got any others that you're listening to?
Yeah, I'm going to blur the lines a little bit. There's one that I like called Popcorn Theology.
Okay.
And so, but it's pretty cool. I mean, now, spoiler alert, they do movie reviews. These two guys, they do movie reviews of most recent movies. And so they do a good job of kind of letting you know as they start talking, hey, listen, if you want to stop listening now because you haven't seen the movie, you better stop listening now because there are spoilers in there, but they understand people like me that hate to be spoiled on particular plots. But, so like half the podcast is them just kind of talking about the particular movie. So I think like one of the most recent ones is Ghostbusters or something that they did. Yeah, they just did a review on Ghostbusters. It's not just recent ones. Like they've done like episode 243 was John Wick 1-3. So, but, so they're talking about, but then they actually make a switch and start talking about theological concepts as it relates to things from that movie, and then you can be the judge if they do a good job of transitioning and making connections there. But I think it's fun to listen to. So yeah, I'm blurring the lines, but that's kind of a fun one that I like to go back to every now and then.
That's awesome. That one I haven't heard of. And so, hopefully today you've heard of a podcast or two that you may want to check out. And again, not all of these we can recommend wholeheartedly. It is, however, what we're listening to. And it's important for you to always place what's being said up against the great standard of God's word, especially when we're talking about ministry, about theology. I do not expect the Office Ladies to be theologically sound. That's just my, as I enter those podcasts, I know it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
However, I do need to make sure that I'm not listening just to junk. And so some of the especially the ones about youth ministry and about, ministry and leadership, I think both of us could say we've gotten a lot out of those. And so that it's easy for us to say, hey, check them out. It may not be for you. You may not like the tone of somebody's voice. I mean, that may be something that you have a hard time listening to. But take some time, find some things. We want to keep learning in this process. So any final words for our listeners today, Chris?
Yeah, I'm going to give you two quick ones. This is a category that we haven't mentioned, and this is just because I'm a dad. And I've got two boys. So one of them is called Dad Tired. That's a podcast that I've started listening to, and it's actually don't judge a book by its cover. Don't judge a podcast by its title. But it's a good podcast for dads out there of young kids, even of older kids. So Dad Tired, that's a good one. One episode I would suggest going to first is the one with John Tyson. It was an interview that he just most recently did. So check that out, Dad Tired. And then the second one that I just started listening to with my boys, and I haven't found a lot of podcasts out there that I can listen to or do listen to with my boys. So if you have some, I'd love to hear from all of our listeners. But it's called the Warrior Kid Podcast, and this is based off the 2 books that Jocko Willink has written specifically to. I think we would probably classify them as tweens, right? 12, 13-year-olds, kind of coming of age young men. And I believe these books are a response by Jocko to the Diary of a Wimpy Kid kind of series. And so his 2 books are called The Way of the Warrior Kid. And anyway, so he has a podcast. So I've read book 1 with my boys, and then the podcast is basically a question answer type podcast. Based with a character from the book. So they've enjoyed that, and it's been helpful for us to start conversations as they are becoming young men.
We want you to be a lifelong learner. That's really at the heart of this. It's important for us to be reading, but again, we don't always have time to read, so maybe you're trying to get in some exercise. Use that time. Listen to somebody. Maybe if you're going to listen to, like I said, Raynor's podcasts are always 25 minutes in length. A lot of podcasts, you can see how long it's going to be. Work out, take a walk during that period, unwind. But don't waste your time. Use it for his kingdom. Use it for the glory of God. And so keep learning, keep growing. And we want to do all of these things because student ministry matters.
Thanks for listening to the Student Ministry Matters podcast. Get connected at studentministrymatters.com or follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Student Ministry Matters. Until next time, keep up the great work with your students because the work matters.